Hi there, Grand Design owners. Today in your 2019 Grand Design Solitude, we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install Hydrastar's 1600 PSI actuator. We're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to get your old electric drum brake system off and completely convert it over to a electric over hydraulic disc brake conversion. We're going to be using Kodiak's disc brake conversion kit, and we're going to need two of those because we've got two axles here. We're going to be using Kodiak's 15-foot flexible tandem axle line kit to deliver all of our fluid from an actuator at the front back to our disc brakes here. And we'll be using Hydrastar's 1600 PSI actuator to provide that delivery of the fluid to our brakes. What made you do the decision to go from the electric drums to the electric over hydraulic?
Oh, just the sheer panic when I'm on an arterial road and someone decides to stop in front of me for a red light, and I've got to take 26,000 pounds and bring it to a quick stop. Okay. So it was just that sheer. The brakes overall, I just always felt uncomfortable that I wouldn't be able to stop in time when there happened to be an accident or something. Otherwise, I've been RVing for 36 years. This is the first time I finally decided to drop the big bucks, and not really big bucks with you guys because it's a fantastic deal here. So it was just finally time with this much rig behind me. I wanted to be able to stop.
All right, well, let's go ahead and test it out. I will say one of the cool things about this system, the way it kind of activates, it's not as instantaneous as the electric. It does kind of ramp it up to that pressure. It's over a quick amount of time, but it makes it less likely that it's going to lock up and slide, because once you lock up, you lose your stopping power. You just start to go. So we'll get out here and we'll see just how it feels, and if you can maybe notice any differences on the application versus your electric.
Okay. Yep. It's almost like it's not there.
That's what we like to hear. We didn't really talk about it, but there is a lot of these vehicles with your factory controllers. There's an option in there to switch it over to electric over hydraulic. Mm-hmm. We already made that adjustment there.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, because it won't. If you don't make that change, it may not operate exactly as you expect it to. So if you guys are going to test yours out and it doesn't seem like something's quite right, double check your vehicle if you're using a factory controller to make sure you've made the change over to electric over hydraulic, so the system knows what equipment we're working with.
Yep, it was easy on the Ford to make that switch, so made that already.
And a lot of guys that I've had kind of test them out afterwards, they can actually stop their truck with the manual slide. It's got that much stopping power. And there it is, boy, bringing us right to a stop.
Yep, exactly. Fantastic. Yeah, I've already got 18,000 miles on this rig in 3 years, and but we keep our rigs over 10 years, so we've got a lot more years to enjoy this.
Well, that's good. With as much driving you do, there's a good chance that you might have to put a set of pads on it at some point, and it's a whole lot easier to do on that setup than it will be with the old electric drum brakes.
Oh yeah, no, this is the first one in 36 years I finally have disc. There's always that question, are they set right? Do you have to manually adjust them or not?
Yeah.
All those hassles that go with drum brakes that they don't have anymore. So.
All right, well, thanks for spending some time with us. Get you back out on the road and enjoy your adventuring.
Oh, I appreciate it very much. I've been using you guys for years. This is the first time I had to do an install with you, but it went really sweet. Appreciate it very much, man.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And this is what our actuator looks like when it's installed. Our actuator here is typically mounted in the front cabinet and provides all the pressure that we need to activate a disc brake system. It has a 1600 PSI output, which is the required pressure that we need to activate our disc brake system. There are other actuators available here at each trailer, and they do come in varying pressures. You want to make sure you're getting the 1600 PSI one if you're going to be doing disc brakes. Lower ones, such as like a 1200 PSI, is only going to be acceptable for a drum brake system. So this is a really nice actuator though. Everything's kind of complete inside of this package here. We've got 4 wires that come out with it for all of our necessary connections, and it kind of replaces the wiring that you would normally run to the brakes at the back of your trailer. Normally on your axle you'd run your brake output wire and a ground wire back there to activate the magnet. We've got our brake output wire here right at our module, and we get ground right here as well. The additional circuits we've got are for power for our unit here, so that way it has power all the time from our battery. And the reason why we need power on this unit all the time is for breakaway events. In the event that we disconnect between our trailer and our vehicle, that we have a catastrophic disconnect, our unit here needs to still have power on it. A lot of your other, your typical electric over hydraulic will have a battery on there with a breakaway switch that would physically send power to the brakes. With this unit, the breakaway switch actually comes down our yellow wire and lets the system know that a breakaway has occurred, so we can use the most appropriate strategy to apply the brakes with the dedicated power circuit that it has installed there. And this typically is going to put it in like a full bore mode to deadhead it to get that max pressure out of it. You can use that to check for leaks as well. Let's go ahead and just see the system activate here. There's a couple of ways that it can activate. It can activate either from a brake controller input down our blue wire here, or again from the breakaway switch. We'll go ahead and show you both. They're going to seem identical as we're looking at it here because we're just hearing the unit operate. But first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to use our test box, which acts like a brake controller, to send a feed down to the trailer. And we heard the unit activate. I went ahead and turned it off there. Next thing I'm going to do is pull our breakaway switch pin, and you'll see that it also activates. And then I'll put the pin back in and it shuts down. So you can see we get very similar function as an electric over hydraulic, but we're going to get a significantly reduced stopping distance with the disc brake setup and the extra power that we've got here from our actuator. And we've got our output here at the back of our actuator to send the fluid out to our brakes. We've got a lot of different line kits available here at E-Trailer. You can go with a flexible option like we've done here, where it's entirely flexible line from front to back. Or if you have a brake line bending tool and a little bit more time, it takes a little bit longer to do a hard line kit, you could do a hard line kit as well and bend that and get it all the way routed out. I really like these flexible line kits because they greatly reduce the amount of time it takes to swap over to an electric over hydraulic setup, because it's much easier to route all of the components, and you can get these all in various lengths so you can get the most optimal length for your particular trailer. We're using the 15-foot flexible line kit from Kodiak with our system today. And one more thing that I like about this unit is the internal proportioning valve that will attempt to deliver the fluid evenly and equally to all brakes at the same time, so you get nice smooth brake activation. Unlike your electric brakes, once the signal is sent to the brakes, it's kind of just at full power, and they kind of want to almost like they don't necessarily lock up. It depends on the pressure that you're sending to them as far as your electrical output on your brake controller, but it's kind of instantaneous. Once that's sent to it, that hits instantly, and you kind of feel it in the trailer. With this, it's going to go on a little bit smoother. It kind of ramps up to that pressure. It does it over a very short amount of time, but it applies much more naturally, and it just feels more like you're just kind of pulling another vehicle or something behind you that is operating with this very similar brakes that are in your vehicle. So you're going to notice just that when you hit the brakes, it's going to stop at a shorter distance, and it's going to be smoother. It's not going to be abrupt. You're not going to have the pulses and jumps that you can get with some electric brakes. We'll begin our installation here with our vehicle elevated, so that way our wheels are off the ground. So we've got it just parked here in the shop. We're just using the front legs at the front to support it there at the front, and then we went ahead and lifted it up at the back, and we've got it sat down on the locks on our lift. If you're doing this at home, I would recommend you just jack up the back with a jack and then place some jack stands under the frame, so that way you can keep it supported and it's not being supported solely just off of hydraulics. So now we can go ahead and remove our wheel. We got it off the ground, and we're just going to use a 19mm socket to do so. If you don't have an impact like this, before you lift it up, you might want to take a breaker bar and just crack each one of these loose, just about a half a turn to a full turn, somewhere in there, just enough so that way when you lift it up, you're able to get them off. Because what's going to happen, I'll give you a quick just kind of visual here, but if you try to use a gun or a wrench here and you go to put some torque on it, it's going to want to spin the wheel on you, and it's going to make it more difficult. Now if you got a strong enough impact gun, you can just kind of brace the wheel to keep it from spinning and zip it right off of there. We can then remove our wheel, slide it straight out, and we're just going to roll it off to the side. Set a napkin down here or a cloth or something. That's mostly just to prevent us from making a mess, because once we take this cap off, there's going to be grease inside of this component here, so have a nice area there to prevent getting grease all over the floor in your garage. And then I also like having a clean pad to set my components on, because if you just set stuff on the ground, the grease that's on there is going to pick up all the dirt off the ground. And we're going to be cleaning these components, but it just makes it harder to clean, so cleanliness does go a long way. To knock this cap off of here, we're just going to use a rubber mallet, and if you just kind of give it a little bit of a swing, we're not hitting real hard because we don't want to dent the cap. We're just kind of lightly tapping it kind of towards myself here as I'm doing it. Kind of hitting also kind of towards the outer edge, because if you hit in the center, it's going to dent more easily than it will right here on the lip. And as you're tapping it like this, you're going to see it start to slowly walk away. And it's walked out pretty good. I like to switch over to a screwdriver after that, because you get a little more control with the screwdriver, and we can use that to pry it out now that we've made a gap with our hammer. And then we can just set that right down out of the way. Behind our cap there, we have our retaining washer that prevents the nut from backing off. We'll need to pull that off first. That's this kind of gold colored piece you see there. You can use a screwdriver, or a lot of times I like to use needle nose pliers. Then we're going to switch over to a pair of channel locks to remove our nut. This pair is much bigger than you really need. You can get away with a much smaller pair than this. Just go ahead and grab your nut and just thread it off there. And it actually should be loose enough where you could thread it off by hand. I just prefer the channel locks because again, cleanliness, trying to prevent getting grease on my hands, because a little bit of grease on your hands, next thing you know, you touch something else, you got grease on there, and it's just starting to spread all over the place. We can set our nut down. We're going to switch back to our screwdriver now. At this point, the whole drum assembly is ready to slide off, but there's a washer and the outer bearing right behind that washer there. So we're just going to place our screwdriver in place here and kind of just jiggle it and slide it out just a little bit. There we go. We're just trying to get the bearing and that washer to slide onto our screwdriver, so we can set that down. And then I'm going to grab another napkin here real quick. We're just going to set this on the ground. Because we're going to take our assembly off, and there's grease all here. We're going to set it on our napkin. This will just slide straight outward. And then you can set it down. So now that we've got our drum out of the way, we can get our our drum brake assembly that we have behind there removed. I like to clean the grease up first off of that shaft, just to again keep it from getting all over everything. And another reason why you also want to clean this out is because we're going to be replacing the grease. And depending on the grease that you're using, it could potentially be incompatible with the previous grease. Greases are specific in their chemical compound. And if you're going to be mixing greases, you want to make sure you're using greases of the exact same compound, so that way they don't break down because of any dissimilarities they may have. So if you're unsure what grease you currently have, I'd recommend just cleaning it all out of there. So that way when you're going back with all new grease, you minimize the chance of that dissimilar grease occurring. So we are going to be using red grease though, that's what the color was there. So there's a good chance if you stay with the same color, they're the same type, but that is not always the case. So it is important to just kind of know exactly the brand and stuff you've got. So we got that cleaned up. Behind here, we've got 5 studs with nuts on them sticking through. We're going to switch over to a 15mm socket so we can get those zipped off of there. And zipping these nuts off. We don't want to lose these nuts. We're going to be reusing them. So just drop them down here on your napkin. I tend to try to keep these away from grease, because we don't want any grease inside of this brake area. So now that we've got all the nuts removed, the assembly will slide off of there. It is still attached with wiring on the back side. You see these wires right here. They poke through this hole here and they're attached on the other side. So we are gonna have to cut those. I'm gonna slide it out a little bit to make it easier to see. You could cut it first, whichever works best for you. It is also not uncommon for corrosion to have occurred between the metal surfaces there, and it gets kind of stuck. Just grab your mallet, you can kind of persuade it to come off of there. So we'll slide it off. There's our wiring that we'll need to trim off of here. And I always like to leave a little bit of excess on here. We'll put a cable tie and just wrap it around the axle. That way, if for whatever reason, if they ever wanted to convert back to electric brakes, they still have the option to do so easily without having to run too many wires. They probably won't, but I always just like to leave the options available. Your brake assembly should slide right into your drum to help minimize how much space all this stuff's going to take up. We can kind of slide that off to the side, and we're at the point now where we can start installing new components. I am going to do a little bit more cleaning up on this, just get some of this brake dust off of there, clean up. This is where your grease seal is going to ride, so I'm going to clean that up a little bit as well. So here we've got our parts laid out that come in your disc brake conversion here. You've got your caliper, your bracket, and your new disc brake rotor here. So our rotor here, we'll come back to that guy in a minute. We'll have some bearings that we're going to be putting in there. You can potentially reuse your bearings, although I highly recommend replacing them, because I'll show you real quick inside of here. We can see that the races are pre-installed inside of our assembly here. So I do recommend new bearings, because once you put a bearing in with a race, it kind of wears in with the race and they kind of pair themselves to one another. So if you got to pull that bearing out and put it into a new race, you know, it potentially could wear in with that race, but if it's already worn to a certain spot, it just may not wear correctly in that new race and you can get premature failure. So that's why I just recommend 2 new parts, let them match to one another, and you should be good to go. So we'll get back to this guy. We're going to put our bracket on first. The bracket is labeled. You can see here it says outside, so that means it's going to be facing you when you're putting it on. Their orientation we want to put it in does vary depending on the weight of your axles. For us, we're going to be putting it in the rearward facing position towards the back of the trailer. But if you had a heavier axle than what we have, refer to your instructions for the weights on your axles, but you may install it in the top position here depending on the weights if they are high enough. We got 7,000 pound axles, so ours are going to go in this orientation. So we're just going to slide this in place. It should match up and aim towards the rear. You can see you're not going to be able to install it in a weird position like crooked or anything like that. None of the holes are going to line up. So it's only going to line up in positions that it is designed to work in. For example, get to that up position so you can see where that would be. Well, it looks like it's probably just not going to fit that way because this axle is not that size, but up could be a potential way that it would go if you were on a heavier carrying capacity axle. So ours needs to go in this position. It fits that way. It seems like that's the only way it's going to fit, so you almost can't get it wrong then. We'll now install our nuts. We're just reusing the ones that we had. Now, this doesn't come in your kit, and it's not necessary, but just to ensure that there's no issues down the road, I like to put a little bit of blue Loctite on them. So we're just putting a little bit on the studs. Again, it's not needed. These have little star washers that kind of act as like a lock nut to prevent it from backing off, but it's a little extra layer of protection, so I don't have to worry about any liabilities. And we'll just reinstall our nuts. And just go ahead and run them down. So now we need to pack our bearings. So we're going to be using new bearings. We do have a bearing kit available here at eTrailer that has the same sizes we need here to make our installation. These are our new bearings here. To verify that this is the right kit, you can use the numbers on the bearing. You'll want to look at your old bearings. They're all covered in grease over there, so I'm just showing you the new ones. But you just wanted to clean off the back side, and if you look at the back of the bearing, you'll see your number there, and it's a 14125A for our outer, and that matches the one we have. And our inner bearing also has the number on the inside, 25580, and when we compare that with the one that we took off, that's the same number, so these match as well. In this kit, you also receive a grease seal to replace the one that's still inside of our drum there. We haven't actually removed it. It's pretty much impossible to pull out and reuse and not cause a leak afterwards. It is possible to get it out of there and move it over, but usually grease ends up seeping by the seal at that point. So you should probably put a new one on. And you also get new caps as well that go in the end. That comes with the bearing kit, not with the disc brake kit. So we're using this here to complete ours. We're gonna go ahead and pack our bearing up here. Before you install the bearing, we want to get grease in between the inner cavity inside of here. Because it's easy to just slap grease around the outside, you know, but we need grease to be between the inner race, that's this guy here, and the bearings, the little roller bearings that are all around the outside. So that way when it's running on this surface, doesn't have metal to metal contact. So there's a couple of ways you can pack these. You can clean your hands up. You can pack them manually by hand. Just put some grease in your hand. You just kind of smash it in there and just kind of work your way around smashing it in there until you've smashed it in from this side to the point where it starts to come out the other side. That's an acceptable way. That's a really messy way to do it, and it's pretty time consuming doing it by hand. The other options are using a bearing packer. We've got a couple different styles here to show you. The reason why I'm kind of showing you two is because this one here you can purchase here at eTrailer. It's a power built. And then this was just another style. This actually isn't here at eTrailer. This is a style that I'm familiar with though, that I used in the service shop for a long time. I actually love this style. It's very fast. It's very clean. You can see how much grease is not on top of the handle here on top. It's much quicker. And I actually prefer this style for its accuracy as well, because when you're squeezing the grease through with this style, you can physically see the top and see that the grease is going through, so you know when you've packed it properly. This is the style that we sell here at eTrailer, and it does do the job, but it is quite a bit messier. You can see there's grease all over the top piece there, so it's almost impossible to use this and not get grease all over yourself. But it does help save you some time. Packing a bearing by hand does take quite a bit of time to get it to pack all the way through, and you have 2 bearings per wheel. So on this tandem axle trailer, that means you're gonna have to do that 8 times, packing it by hand, and that's pretty tiring and pretty time consuming. So this will definitely help you save some time, even though it's a fairly messy device. So we're gonna go ahead and open it up, pull the top out. We'll drop our bearing down in there, we'll put the top on, and then you fill this thing up with grease here on the back side with a grease gun. The reason why I don't like this style, beyond the mess that you're about to see happen, is that we can't physically see down into the bearing to know that it's packed. And for all we know, we could just be squirting grease around the outside of it and not putting it on the inside. So that's kind of why I don't particularly care for this style. But we're gonna drop it in here and we're gonna pack her on up. So that'll go down in there. After you've got it down in there, we'll then take our grease gun, put it on top here, and fill it up. And this will push the air out and push grease all up around our bearing. So it does pack the inside and the outside for you, which is nice. This one's only gonna, for the most part, pack the inside, but that's kind of the hard thing to do. The outside, you can just smear it on the outside. So the step it's saving is really not all that big of a deal. So we're gonna check it here, see how we look. And yeah, you can see there, all that grease I pumped in there, none of it has gone inside the bearing yet. So we just gotta keep on pumping. So again, it's not nearly as fast as that style. I would highly recommend this style over this one, but if you just need a bearing packer, you can add that to your cart and help save you some time. So there we go, now we're fully packed. Now, the other thing I don't like about this one over this one is if you look inside there, one, this is a huge mess that we gotta dig out of here now to get to our bearing. We're definitely gonna get it all over our hands. And this tube, I used about a half a tube on it just to fill that bearing. So it's a huge waste of grease as well. Now you're gonna waste a lot of grease if you pack it by hand. So you're not wasting more grease with this than you would by hand. So again, this is mainly saving you a ton of time being able to do it that way. But you're about to see here, we're about to get messy again. With this style, typically I could stick my screwdriver down there and pull it out and plop it in there nice and easy. We're gonna try that with this one here, but I get the feeling that it actually didn't work too bad. So it's definitely fully packed all the way around. So we'll just drop it on in right here onto the back side. Get down in there. It should just sit right there in place. And if you were using a style like this one, when you pull it out of there, it's only going to pack the inside. So I usually smear some grease around the outside before I drop it in, if you were using a style like this. We're going to set this aside. We are going to have to pack our outer bearing. It's going to pack the same way, but we don't need to pack it just yet. Let's get our grease seal in so we kind of finish up the back side here, and that'll keep our bearing from falling out of there too. So this is our grease seal. Typically when you install a grease seal, usually, well, one, you have to make sure you put it in the right direction. The side here that with the spring going around it, that's always going to be the inside. It's going to face our bearing. This is our outside right here. But normally when you put these in on most of the assemblies I've worked with in the past, you normally hammer in the seal until it is flush with the lip here. With this particular brake set though, I found that you do need to insert it a little bit further than flush. It has like a chamfered edge there, and you want to be down flush with the chamfered edge, not with the flat edge on top. So there's a couple of ways. You could use a seal driver to install it. We're going to be using just kind of some other methods to show you some. You could just use things you got laying around the house. So we're going to use a block of wood, and we've also got a hole saw here. This hole saw is ever so slightly smaller than our grease seal, so we can use, that'll be a perfect fit to drive it in. I'm going to start with the block of wood though, before we grab our hole saw to finish it off. And we're just going to set it in top and just lightly start tapping it in place. We want to try to drive it in straight. If you get a little crooked, you can straighten it out if it's just a little bit crooked. So we got it pretty far in there. That's actually pretty good. We're up just a little bit on this side here. If we look at it, this side here is pretty good. So we're going to move over to our hole saw now, just to help get it in. It just needs to go just a hair further in, or just a hair crooked, but not enough to where we need to pop it out of there and start over. And then it actually kind of works pretty nicely. It kind of sticks into the wood and makes a nice little tool for you to drive this in. And I do have it slightly offset so I can kind of favor the force to the one side to help straighten it ever so slightly. We're really close to where we need to be there. Just a hair more on this one little side. And that is what we're looking for right there. If you kind of feel around, it's pretty much flush all the way around with that lip of the chamfer there, even all the way across. That's what we're looking for right there. All right, I dropped in our outer bearing now. We're gonna go ahead and get this one packed so that way we're ready for when we need it. And it's gonna pack the same way as the other one. At this point, we're ready to slide our assembly on. We've got our bearing, our outer bearing over there off to the side. It's packed up, ready for when we need it here. And then I did also take the retaining clip. We cleaned that up, got all the old grease off. Same with the nut and with the washer. Those three pieces, go ahead and clean up. We're gonna be reusing those. The bearing, you can leave that dirty. We don't need the old bearing. We got our new ones here. So now we're gonna take our assembly here and we're gonna slide it into place. When we're sliding it in, we wanna try to center it as best we can because we don't wanna nick the rubber grease seal here on like the threads or any surfaces here that could potentially damage the seal. We wanna go straight in with it. I'm keeping my outer bearing here close by because as soon as we slide it on, that outer bearing is gonna slide into place. So it's good to have it in arm's reach there. Go ahead and grab your assembly. And we're just carefully paying attention here, trying not to nick that seal. And then get it slid all the way in, just like that. We're now gonna dig out our other bearing there. Grab our screwdriver again to help minimize the mess we're making here. That's gonna slide in the other side there. Your washer will follow up right behind it, as well as your nut. Now we'll need to set the bearing preload. We really don't want like any preload on it. We kind of want it to be at a perfectly balanced state where there's not excess pressure on it, but it's not too loose. And I'll kind of show you the way I like to do it here. This seems to work out pretty well in most instances. I'm going to switch back to my channel locks. We're going to grab our nut here and we're going to tighten it down. I like to tighten it all the way down first and then we'll back it off. This just ensures that our bearings and everything have fully seated all the way in, that we're not like caught up or in a slight, ever so slight bind or anything like that, because if you are and it's ever so slightly crooked, it's going to eventually not be crooked anymore and then you're going to have a little bit of play in there. So we're just going to tighten that down, a little bit of rotation in there, just kind of checking it. And once we get it snug, which that's pretty snug right there, back it off. And it should be pretty much free. Run it right up till it touches, and that's pretty much right where you want it, right there. We might do a very subtle adjustment to it to get our retaining clip to reinstall, because the retaining clip only fits in certain positions, so you might need to ever so slightly snug it up or loose it up to get our clip to fit. Clip's got a flat spot on it that'll match up with our hub there, so it goes like this. And then these little spacers here, they're either going to have one of these ends on one side of a corner and then one on the other, or both of these will be on a flat spot. It'll work in either of those positions. And we were able to slide it in place right there. It looks like it did ever so slightly loosen up. That's okay. We're right there. We're about where we were touching. Ideally, when you're done and you go to check play, you're going to have an ever so slight amount of play to 0 plays, where it's exactly where you want to be. Just very tiny hair or none at all. But we don't want to have it tighter than that, because then you got pressure on the bearings and we can burn up our bearings. We don't want it looser than that, because then you got play in it and your bearings can kind of walk inside the race. So that's exactly where we want it right there. Got our clip in place. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to fill this up with grease. Now, if we did not have a fitting here on the end to be able to fill up our cavities, this little grease fitting there, we would have wanted to fill the cavities inside, just kind of smash grease in there before we put it on. Pretty much all these larger trailers are going to have the Easy Lube fittings there though, so we can fill it up. And we're going to do this until grease starts to come out of our bearing. So I'm just keeping an eye on it. We're looking for the grease to start coming towards us, letting us know that we've filled up all the chambers. And this next pump here, if you look, you'll see the grease moving. There you go. See how it's squished out? That means we're full. We can now install the cap. You can either reuse your previous one if you clean that one out, or you can use the new ones. I'm actually going to use the previous one only because the ones that came in our kit here, if you look at it, it's a solid cap, which means that if the customer wants to add some more grease to these bearings over time, maybe in the next season he might want to put a couple of pumps in it to make sure it's filled up, he'll have to take this cap off in order to do that. His previous cap has a hole cut out in it with an Easy Lube access cover, so we're gonna opt to just do that, so that way he still has his access cover. So I'm gonna clean all that out and we're gonna put those in, get all that old grease out of there. Here's that access cover that I was talking about. This rubber cap pops out of there. Me personally, I would prefer to have this. I feel like our customer probably would too, would prefer to maintain his Easy Lube functionality. So we'll get that cleaned out and then we'll hammer it back on. All right, so we got all that old grease cleaned out of there. We can go ahead and reinstall our cap now. Just kind of goes into place and then we're just lightly tapping it to put it back on. You don't typically need to hit crazy hard to install these. And you can actually dent up the cap if you hit it too hard. All right, and that looks good. We're fully seated on there. Just like to just spin it around to the other side to make sure that there's not any gap that I couldn't see from the angle I was looking at. But this all looks good. So now we're going to put our caliper on. Make sure your pads are fully seated there. Usually this one here's seated plenty fine when you get it out of the package, but this one oftentimes kind of just falls out of there. It pokes back up in there. There's a little clip that you just got to sit inside the ring if it falls out. You can kind of see it. I'll show you. There's the clip we're talking about. So push that back up in there if it did fall out on you. And then these little, this is the slides here. Every now and then they get in the way when you're trying to install your caliper. So just push the slide a little bit out. You don't need to push it all the way out, just enough to make sure that it'll clear. We'll then take our bolts, we need to slide those in place. and then you're just going to pull them back out a little bit so they also clear. You do need to put them in place first though, at least for the upper bolt. The lower one you can put in at any point, but the top one, the leaf spring is going to be in the way, so it needs to be kind of partially installed like that. We'll then bring it up here to our rotor. Our pads will fit around the rotor, and it'll just kind of rock up into place. You can then slide your bolts in and get each one started. All right, we got that one started. I'm not running it all the way down, but I do like to run it in just a couple of turns, make sure it can't back out. And then we're gonna just get this one down here started. Sometimes you gotta rock it back and forth and fidget with it a little bit. That's exactly what we wanted. Lined up. And then grab our wrench. We're using a 13 millimeter wrench. And since we got them both started, I'm gonna go ahead and just run this one all the way down. I know the top one started. Before you run them both all the way down though, make sure you get them started, because if you run one down and then try to get the next one started, you can't really maneuver the caliper the way you need to get that other one to line up. We can then switch over to our torque wrench and torque them to the specifications outlined in our instructions. All right, so now that we've got everything tightened and torqued, that'll complete our replacement here. You'll just want to make sure you do the same thing over on the other side of your axle, and depending on however many axles your trailer has, repeat that process for each axle. So we're working on a tandem axle trailer, so we've got a total of 4 of these that we're going to complete to get the entire conversion over. So now that we've got this done, we are going to be using some other components to fully convert this over from an electric brake system to an electric over hydraulic disc brake system. We've got our disc brakes and calipers installed, but now we need hydraulic lines to go from an actuator at the front. We need our actuator as well. We're going to be using Hydrastar's 16,000 PSI actuator to provide us with the pressure we need to apply our brakes. It does need to be the 1600 PSI one is the recommended one, because we do need a higher pressure to activate and stop with disc brakes than we do with drum brakes. A lot of times your drum brake actuators, if it's like a hydraulic, electric over hydraulic, you want something that's 12,000 PSI roughly. But for these ones, we want that extra 400, bringing us up to 1600 to apply these. So we're using Kodiak's our brakes here. The line kit we're using is from Kodiak. It's a flexible line kit. And again, the actuator is going to be from Hydrastar. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the actuator now. We'll get the actuator installed, and then we can get all the lines routed from the actuator back here to our assemblies. So here we are in the front compartment of our trailer. This is our actuator here. We decided to mount it on the passenger side here, and we wanted to go up pretty high just to minimize how much space we're taking up here in this compartment, so that way the compartment's still going to be usable for the customer. And by having it up high, that's also going to do some more things for us. It's going to make it gravity bleed better, because if our main reservoir is up here, gravity's naturally going to want to take that fluid and bring it down and deliver it back to the brakes that we've installed back there. And that just helps out to speed up the bleeding process by putting it up a little bit higher. You don't want to put it up so high to where you can't fill it, so we did give ourselves enough room here to where we can still remove the cap and fill it with fluid. What I did is I just stood in the compartment and I lifted it up high enough to where I could still see down inside of it, so that way you could also check the level. If you got it up too high, you can't really get a good visual. So this is kind of where we chose this location. Now, to get it mounted up in this location, we did make some custom brackets to install it. That's what you're seeing down here. Both of these brackets are short brackets. They're actually typically used for mounting up like a 7-way connector or a 4-way connector at the back of your vehicle. But they're fairly thick, and they're almost a perfect size for this job. We are using 2 of them, because you only get 1 of these in the kits. But you could source your own metal. If you've got some scrap metal laying around, you could source that as well. This is just what we chose to use because we've got these available here. The brackets have 4 holes in them. You can kind of see 2 holes here. These are the factory holes that's in it. it has the exact same 2 factory holes on the other side of the bracket over here. So what I did is I lined up one of those holes, the one that's closer to the inside of the bracket, the one closer to the middle. We lined that hole up with the hole in our bracket for our actuator here. We lined up with the hole in the actuator. And then I marked the other hole on the bracket here. I then used a 5/16 drill bit to drill out the hole that I marked. And then I also used the 5/16 drill bit to enlarge the factory hole that's here in the bracket. After that, I was able to slide my hardware through this. You do have to provide your own hardware. It doesn't come included with your actuator. So we're using 5/16 bolts. They're about 1 inch in length. I would say you're going to need at least probably 3/4 of an inch to have enough to be able to bolt through these components. On top, it's just the bolt head, but on bottom we did put a flat washer and a lock washer before putting the nut on to ensure they can't back off. And this also gives us a little bit more surface area on our components here, kind of holding it in place. After we got this mounted up to the actuator, we did the exact same thing over here on this side to get this one mounted up. And after that, we then took here at the back, this angle here. There's no holes in this, so I just marked my own holes and drilled it out with 5/16. After I drilled one bracket, I did hold this bracket up to the other bracket, just so that way my holes would be in the same place, and I used this bracket as a template to drill out this bracket. After that, you've now got all the holes you need. You got your brackets installed. Just hold the actuator up to roughly the position you want it in, and mark your holes, drill those out, and then you can install that with your own hardware as well. We use the same hardware for these, same bolts, with on the other side it's got a flat washer, lock washer, and nut to keep it in place. I did need an assistant for this. I wasn't able to tighten these down and hold the nut on the other side, so I did have to have somebody in the compartment that's over there. There is a propane tank right on the other side of this panel, and there's a side compartment so you can access that propane. So I did have somebody in that compartment to hold the nuts while I tightened them down. You also want to open that compartment up before you drill any holes here, just so you can see where your propane tank is. We've got ours up high enough to where our propane, the top of our propane tank's about here, so that way we don't have to worry about drill bits going through and accidentally hitting our tank or anything like that. So that takes care of getting it mounted in the location we need it installed. And you can do this on the driver's side as well. Oftentimes I usually do the driver's side just because it keeps it a little bit more in line with how a vehicle would be, but it doesn't matter if it's on the passenger side here. All of our wiring comes out here at the front. We put the wiring towards the front of the trailer, and we put the outlet for the fluid towards the rear of the trailer. I did put some wire loom over the wiring. It doesn't come included with your kit, just to help protect it and make it look nicer. That just kind of runs along the back to here. Another reason why we chose the passenger side and up high is because we can actually access our factory wiring in this location, which makes this installation significantly easier if you can utilize the factory wiring. So this is the factory wiring right here. This gray sheathing. Inside of it, it has a blue and a white wire. So real quick, before we go to hook these wires up, I'm going to show you how I identified this wire. And to do that, we're actually going to head to the front of the trailer where the junction box is, remove that cover so we can have a look inside. Because if you can see your wires inside, it makes it a lot easier to identify them over here. So we're just going to do that for purposes so you can kind of identify them yourself on your own. Because every trailer can be slightly different. Even if you have the exact same year, make, and model, the routing and wire colors can potentially change because these trailers aren't standardized like your typical, your Ford, Chevy, Toyotas, those other bigger manufacturers. Those vehicles are all identical if they're all the same vehicle with the same options, but these ones here may not be because they're built by a crew of people and things can be routed slightly different based on the crew that was building it. So let's head up to the front so we can take a look at that. So here's our junction box. We took the cover off. There was just 2 screws that was holding it in place, and if you look here, these are slotted, so I just loosened the screws a couple of turns and I was able to kind of rotate this bracket, the cover right off of there, and the screws are still in place. After that, you can pull your wiring down to get an idea of what's going on. All the wires that are right here, this is the 7-way connector, so this is the wires at the front you'd plug into your truck, and then everything coming out this side is what's going to our trailer. So when you pull this down, one of the first things I usually look for, because they do tend to here at the junction box follow standard wire colorings most of the time. So what I'm looking for here is the blue wire, because the blue wire is often your brake controller output. And here we can see our blue wire, and one of the things you want to look for on the blue wire is for a breakaway switch wire. So we can see one of the wires here, this is from the 7-way, we got in, the other blue wire here that's out, and there's a small black nub here. I already cut off the black wire. That was the breakaway switch wire. And you can follow your breakaway switch. There's your breakaway switch here on the side. You can follow those wires back. They route back inside to our box here and right inside. So that way you can kind of just verify, hey, there's the black wire from the breakaway. Is it going to my blue wire? It is. Cool. If it is, that ensures you that the blue wire is for your brake output, because it would only have the breakaway switch attached to it if it was. The other side of your breakaway switch is always going to hook to a positive source, which in this case is our black wire, and that's usually the case on most trailers, is the black wire inside of your junction box is going to be power. And you can see the other small black wire is connected there, and this is our power circuit. So we cut off the other end of our breakaway switch wire, because we're going to need to hook into this breakaway switch to make our system work. We also want to follow this blue wire back, because what I'm looking for when I follow this back is I'm looking to see that it goes into a gray sheathing, and it sure enough does go into that gray sheathing right there. And there's a white wire also inside of that gray sheathing, and that just goes to ground. We are going to be removing that ground because we're going to repurpose this ground wire, because we won't need it up here anymore for our braking system. So we're going to repurpose that, but that's kind of what I wanted to look for. I could see it goes into the gray harness. I know I'm looking for a white and a blue wire in a gray harness. So that's how I was able to identify it over there. Once I found the gray harness, I cut a little slit into it just to see that I have blue and white wires inside. And once I did, I knew, okay, this is the same wiring as here at the junction box. So now we're back inside. Here's the white and the blue wire, the other end of them that are coming from that junction box. We cut this gray harness here in half. The other half of it's just kind of hanging out in here somewhere. I kind of just tucked it back in there. It is going back to the electric brake wires and stuff. You can just leave it in there. It's not necessary to remove it. It's tucked in here somewhere where I had cut it. It's probably in this big harness. We don't really need to see the other end. We're not going to use it, and it's perfectly fine after you cut it to just leave that wiring in there. We're not going to use it. So now that we've got it cut, we've just got two wires that are heading from here up to that junction box. The blue wire we saw is connected to the blue wire up in the junction box, and that's the brake controller output. The brake controller output on our actuator here is the blue wire. So we're just going to hook the blue wire that was pre-existing there to the blue wire on our actuator. And that way when we hit our brake controller, or hit the brakes, or use the manual slide, anything like that, it's going to send its signal out this blue wire to activate the brakes here on our trailer. Now there are 4 wires coming out of this though, so we got to get them all hooked up. So let's take a look. I'm going to peel this off just to make it a little easier to see real quick. So this is the white wire that we had cut. We attached it up there at the junction box. We cut off the end of the white wire that was connected to ground, and we connected the other end of the white wire to the breakaway switch. Once we get, so it's coming from the breakaway switch up there, it's coming back down our sheathing here, and we're going to connect this to the yellow wire. That is the breakaway switch signal wire for our controller. In normal electric brakes, your breakaway switch just goes to the brake actuating wire to activate them, but it is different here on electric over hydraulic. It has its own dedicated wire that it needs to go to. And we just stripped them back and used butt connectors to make those connections. The 2 wires we got left is the black wire coming out of our unit and the white wire, and that's just power and ground, with power being our black and ground being our white. The white wire right here, you could, if you wanted to, just run it into like a self-tapping screw or something. But we wanted to try to get as best a ground connection as we possibly could, so I extended the white wire, which is some extra white wire we had here at the shop. You can use any, I would recommend using similar gauge wire to what's coming off of your unit here, so probably no smaller than a 12 gauge. That'll go down. I just kind of followed it down because these are the ground wires coming from our battery here, so we just followed it all the way down here to where this existing ground stud was, and we added our ground wire to that existing ground location. So that way we're kind of tied in with directly with the ground from our battery and stuff like that. Our power wire, we are going to be hooking up a little different. We want to have proper circuit protection, and we're going to be using a 40 amp circuit breaker. So it's located right here. I just use 2 self-tapping screws to run it right into the metal here to mount the breaker. The black wire coming from your module here, we're going to put a small ring terminal on and attach it to the silver stud of our breaker. The bronze stud of our breaker needs to hook to our power source. So we come out, we kind of just go over, and that's our disconnect switch up there. And on our disconnect switch, this wire here is going to be our battery wire. This is hot at all times. This side of the switch is only activated when the switch is on. So we want to make sure our braking system is always going to be able to have power to it for any kind of emergency event. So we're going to be hooking it to this stud right here. I've got a ring terminal. Make sure you get one that's going to be a large enough size to fit over the stud. And then we can go ahead and get this attached. This is the black wire that's just coming over from the bronze post of our circuit breaker. It just kind of routes around there. We'll strip it back. And then we'll add our ring terminal to it and crimp it down. So now we just need to hook it to our power source. So I'm going to remove that nut. Now the customer did request to eliminate the disconnect switch. The reason why he wants to eliminate it is because the way his charging system is connected to his trailer. If he were to disconnect, use his disconnect here and disconnect the trailer from the battery, the truck that's hooked to the vehicle will no longer be able to trickle charge the battery, which means every time you hit the brakes, the braking system here, when it activates, it's going to be using up some of that battery charge. And it's possible that on a very long trip, this actuator could completely deplete the battery to a point where it can't activate anymore. So normally you would be able to trickle charge the batteries to ensure that they don't get drained down by the actuator here. So instead of rewiring it to where the 7-way connector goes here, the customer just wanted us to do this. So we're not going to be changing stuff around. We're just going to be eliminating this switch. So that way it's just always on and it's always going to be able to get charged from the truck. So I'm going to move this wire here just to the other side, and that'll essentially disable the switch to a point where it's basically going to be always on regardless of the position of the switch. So I'm going to get my socket here to remove those, get them swapped over, and also add this one to it. Zip off this nut. We're going to use this particular switch here as a 17mm socket for our nut there. Get this one removed. All right, so I'm going to slide on this guy first just because it seems to be the biggest. And then we're just going to put both of these onto this one. So I'm going to this is a pretty thick wire. We'll see if we can't maybe reorganize it a little so it'll attach easier. There we go. And then we'll just reinstall our nut. Angle these a little differently. Just like that. And then we'll put the nut back on this one. So if in the future, if he's got plans to re-enable this switch and change his charge wire around, he can do it the way that he wants to do it at that time. That completes all of our wiring. We've now got all 4 wires hooked up. We've got it properly mounted. So the next thing that you would need to do for this setup, I'm just going to put this loom back on here to make it pretty again. We need to get our lines now hooked up because you really don't want to activate your system to test it out just yet because it's dry right now, and activating the system dry could potentially damage the unit, so you don't want to operate it dry. So our lines would be the next step. They don't come included with your actuator or with your brakes or anything. They are a separate piece, and the reason why that they are separate is because the trailers have so many varying lengths and stuff like that. You'll want to make sure you pick the most appropriate length kit for the length of your trailer. We're going to be using a 15-foot flexible line kit from Kodiak to complete our installation today. So we'll begin our installation of our lines here at the actuator. We've got the main line right here. That's the longest line that comes in your kit. This is the 15-foot edition, so that's our 15-foot line. It'll thread here into the back of the actuator, and then we'll route it out and go to the back. To get it out, we drilled a hole here. We did this before we hooked the line up. We drilled a hole. I used a 3/4 inch grommet here, so you'll want to drill out a 3/4 inch hole, or an 11/16 hole will also work, but it's really tight getting the grommet in. It's probably a slightly better fit if you were to do that, but both will work. You can use either size hole and this grommet will work there. After we got the hole drilled, we fed the hose through, and then I put the grommet on the hose just because it was such a tight fit fitting over the hose too. And then I was able to push the grommet into place. After that, I attached my hose right to the fitting here at the back of the unit. You'll snug this down using a 3/8 line wrench, and then I like to hold the nut that it threads into to ensure I don't damage the actuator, and you'll use a 9/16 for this size. We're now on the outside of the trailer. This is our propane tank compartment. This is on the other side of that wall that we were just in, where we mounted the actuator. This is the hole that we drilled. There's our grommet, and here's our hose where it passes through. After it passes through, we're going to route it towards the brake assemblies at the back. So we just kind of come out, kind of curves. We use these clamps here. These, you can buy kit with these clamps. So you can get this either in a kit with the fasteners, or you can get just individual clamps, whatever works best. You can get those here at eTrailer. And these will simply just clamp right around your line. You will get some of these with the line kit, but you may or may not need more depending on the length that you're routing. And then every so often, I would say probably about every foot, maybe 1.5 feet, we try to put another one. Not so much here on the vertical because it's kind of just going straight down. So we put another one here at the bottom. Right here, it kind of does a 90-degree bend, but there's this little lip that's located right here at the bottom. And I didn't like the way that the hose was touching the lip. So I used some vacuum line that we had laying around. You can purchase vacuum line here at eTrailer if you do need some. And we just cut about, I would say it's probably about 3 inches of vacuum line, and I put a slit down the side of it. And that allowed me to kind of peel it open and slide it over my brake line. That's going to act as a nice rubber barrier protecting our hose from any edges. And you'll be seeing these in quite a few spots. This actually works very well for protecting a flexible line from vibrations, because that's what's going to happen when you drive down the road. These lines are going to be hitting your trailer's going to be hitting potholes and a bunch of stuff. It's going to vibrate, and that can eventually wear through these brake lines. So putting this hose on here means it's got to wear all the way through this rubber first, which you'll probably be servicing this brake system before it wears through that. So then it makes this 90-degree turn. We go into another one of those clamps here, and then from here we just kind of run it down, adding clamps every so often as it goes down the side, just to try to give us a nice straight run. And that ran all the way down the frame of our trailer till we got to the back of that frame piece there, and it's right in front of our leaf spring here on our front axle. So there was an existing fastener that was already there holding up the underbelly, so we just removed the fastener and reused it to secure a clamp to. We then continue on. This is where we used another piece of that vacuum line, and I just kind of put a little slit in the undershield here and ran a cable tie through it to secure it to that. You can put a little bit of silicone or some of this expanding foam on here if you wanted to seal that back up. From there, the main line will stop pretty much right here behind the front axle. And we've got a 4-way fitting that comes in our kit, and this is going to allow us to branch this line off to the various brakes. This is a tandem axle kit, so we've got a total of 4 brake assemblies we need to supply fluid to. So the main line will go in. You'll have the fitting here that's facing towards the other side of the trailer. There's a hose that'll run across the axle for that one. You'll have another slightly shorter hose that'll go from this front axle to the rear axle. And then now this hose here, I haven't hooked it up yet. This does not come in the kit. This one here has a 90-degree fitting on it here. This is the one that actually comes in the kit, this hose here. The problem with this hose, one, you can see, if we kind of hold them up side by side, you'll see that it's slightly shorter in length than the other hose. So it's a little bit shorter. And it also is straight on both ends, the hose that comes in the kit. This one has a 90-degree on it, which really does make a big difference in keeping your hose away from your tire, because the tire is going to be rotating here. So if you were to thread in this piece, it naturally puts your hose facing towards the tire like that, and it could potentially rub. This also then needs to wrap back around and go into the caliper, and you can see we're stretching this thing out. Now we do have the suspension hanging, and when you're driving around it's likely never going to be this extended, but if you go to service your vehicle and you go to lift it up and you got a hose like this on here, the axles could come down and damage the work that you just did. So I really just don't recommend using this. If it's too short, just don't use it. You'll want this extra length for service and stuff down the road to be able to easily hook this up and maintain your trailer. So we opted to replace that. There's two of those short hoses that come in your kit. So we are adding in these two 90-degree ones to make sure that we get a good installation here. So we're going to come back to this one. We'll show you how to hook all the hoses together. With this one, I left this one loose here. And we'll just kind of continue routing the rest of them and then come back to that. So we'll start with this one here. This is the one that's going to go across the axle. You'll have two of these in your kit. These are the second longest hoses. And there was an existing bolt there, so we utilized it to clamp it. And then to take up some of the slack, I did kind of go between the two axles here, cable tying it in place with that vacuum line over it. Found another factory fastener here that we were able to utilize, and then it just routes down to our caliper from there. We found another factory fastener here on our destination going across, so we went ahead and utilized it, and then from there it just goes down and into our caliper. Now once I get the trailer back on the ground, I might make another small adjustment to this, because we got plenty of slack here where we're not putting any stress on it, but since this is such a long run of hose here, once the axle gets back on the ground and it sits back in its resting position, it's possible this hose could hang down lower than I want. So I may or may not add another one of those vacuum hose and cable tie clamps on here to take up a little slack. At this point, it doesn't seem like we're going to need it. Seems good right here, but we'll definitely, you always want to verify after you get your wheels back on the ground, double check everything and make sure you don't have any rubbing, anything hanging down too low. So we got this one run across, goes right into the caliper. Let's head back to our four-way for our next line. This line here is the line that'll take you to your second axle. This is the third longest line in the kit. So it's shorter than the main line, shorter than the ones that go across the axle. You're looking for this guy, the third longest. So it just goes from here. We hit that factory fastener again, take up some of the slack by kind of going in and then coming back out. Another one of those vacuum lining cable ties. And then when we get here just behind the rear axle, you'll have a three-way fitting. We've mounted it right there using cable ties. The three-way fitting just has two attachments that's going to come out of it from there. You'll have another one of those second longest lines that go across the axle. This is just like the front axle. It just runs across. We'll attach it at a couple of spots and it'll go into the caliper over there. There's really not much difference between this one. I guess the routing is slightly different shape just to take up some of the slack and get it in a location where it's not going to rub on anything. And then the other one is that 90-degree line that we replaced from that, the one that comes in the kit. We use the 90-degree here. It goes into our fitting, just kind of comes down and then it goes into the caliper. So we're going to head back to the front axle now, to the caliper that doesn't have a hose on it, and we'll show you how to get these attached. So here we're at the front one again. We got our line. It's just loosely attached at the top into the four-way. I just threaded it into there. And then on the other end, you get caps on them when you get them to keep dirt and debris out. Pull your cap off of there. And then this will route down to your caliper and thread into the attachment coming out of your caliper right here on the back. So it just slides in. You will have to kind of push the little fitting towards the caliper as you go to tighten it to get it to catch. Once it catches, it'll just thread in like normal. Now with these ones, I prefer to tighten the caliper one first. So we're just going to come down here and tighten this caliper one using a 3/8 line wrench. And this is a line wrench. And I'm going to try to twist the hose a little bit so that way when it's tightening, it kind of goes back into a good resting position. But you'll take a look at the line wrench here, you'll see why we need the line wrench. It's kind of like your normal wrench, giving you those faces, but it has a small notch cut out of it, so that way it'll actually grab pretty much, I would say like maybe 80% of the nut. It's almost all the way around it, just minus that little cut. That little cut lets you slide it over a hose so you can get them in place. This is important though that you have this type of wrench, because this brass that you see here is a very soft metal. And it needs to be soft for this application, because when we tighten this down, we're smashing it all together and it's going to seal up, you know, completely tight to where none of our brake fluid is going to be able to leak out. So it needs to be soft material for that purpose. But since it is a soft material and you have to tighten them fairly tight to prevent any leaks from occurring, if you use a regular wrench that doesn't have as much grip on it, you end up just rounding off the nut, and then you can't tighten it down. You've ruined it. You got to replace it, and you're going to need a set of these anyway to make our attachment, or at least this particular size. So we twisted it back that way some. That way when we tighten it down, it kind of gives it a good natural direction up towards our fitting there. And we got that nice and snug. So now we're going to tighten this one up. And head up here. There are flat spots on this piece here, but I'll be honest with you, these flat spots are in terrible locations. You use a 1/2 inch wrench on the flat spot to try to hold it, but they put the flat spot on the same side that's facing the bottom. So if you attach it already, you can't put nothing on it. And if you don't attach it first, you attach all your hoses to it and hold it in your hand, it's hard to work with that way as well. And then it just makes it more difficult to figure out kind of where you want it to be, to where it's going to allow all your hoses to reach the location. So I found that you can just hold it by hand here and usually get enough tightness out of it without having to use the flat spots. You will have to kind of pull a little bit on it, and then we're also going to, same thing with this one, as we tighten it, I'm going to push on it a little bit this way, so that way as it snugs down, it kind of falls right into the position we want it in. And I'm just kind of keeping a little bit of force on there so I can get this fully snugged down. That seems pretty good right there. If you need to, you can swap your wrench over to the other direction, keep it away from the hose, but that's pretty tight. So all of your lines at this point now, we're going to go back and we're going to double check that we have snugged down every single one of these, because the next step we're going to be doing is filling our system with fluid and bleeding the system. And if you've got a leak at any point, that's going to allow air to introduce into the system, and you pretty much got to start the process of bleeding it over again if you've got a leak. So just double check all the fittings here at this 4-way, double check them back at the 3-way, double check them at every caliper, and also just double check your tightness up at the actuator. Make sure all those are nice and snug, and then we can start getting fluid in this thing. So to bleed your brakes, you're going to want to make yourself a little catch system, because this actuator is 1600 psi and it moves quite a bit of volume too, so it shoots out of here pretty far. So a hose actually works just fine. If you just got a hose, you can slide over the fitting there. You can just go down into a catch pan. We went into a bottle, just kind of an old little sports drink bottle, just kind of went into there. So after you get that on there, I did go ahead and crack the bleeder screw loose, just kind of crack it loose a little bit. I did probably maybe 2 turns, and we're using a 5/16 wrench to do so. Once you got that cracked loose, we can go fill our reservoir up, and this will help push some of the air out as we're filling the reservoir, and then we're going to need an assistant to help us fully bleed the system. So now we're going to go ahead and fill it up. We're using .3 brake fluid to fill it up. You can get this from your local hardware store. I did wrap a rag around the top there, and I got a little flashlight. Now I've already topped it all the way up because I got to get my whole body up in here so I can see to verify that it's filled up. But you just want to make sure you get it filled up. It is going to slowly drain down as it fills the lines, and that's why we cracked that bleeder at the back, to let it push the air out as it's doing it. But that's only going to get you so far. You're still going to need an assistant to help you fully bleed it. That just speeds up the bleed process by doing that. Leave the cap off during the bleed procedure. The rubber inside of here, if you have the cap on it, it can actually suck this rubber thing right out of the cap, so you don't want to have that on there. So I've got an assistant up here at the front who's going to monitor the reservoir here, making sure to top it up whenever it gets low. If you drain the reservoir out, you have to start all the way over again because you sucked in air here at the front, so you have to start bleeding it all the way from the front back. So you'd really want to make sure you got somebody monitoring this to ensure it doesn't go dry. The other thing the person at the front will do is activate the system. There's two ways they could do that. They could pull the breakaway pin on the breakaway switch, and that would activate the system. Or if they've got a brake controller in the truck or something, they could use the manual slide on the brake controller to activate the system. We're using our text box, which mimics the manual slide on a brake controller. So we're gonna head back to the back on the brake. Our assistant's gonna be up here filling this up and activating it, and we're gonna get this all bled out. So we're back here at our brake. I'm closing up the bleeder screw because we need it to be closed. Whenever you kind of start this process and finish it, we want this hose to be closed off, so that way air can't draw back in this way. Because if you have your system activated and it's pushing fluid out, when they turn the system off, if you don't have this closed, the pressure wants to equalize and it can actually draw air in this port too. So you want to open it, activate, close, and then turn off the activation there. So our assistant's going to be running that for us, so we're ready to roll. So if you want to go ahead and activate it, we're good to go. So I cracked it loose, just about a half a turn. He activated it. We're looking at the hose for bubbles, and that's actually pretty clean. There is a little bit of bubbles in there. I closed it. So now we're going to give a moment for our assistant to just double check the reservoir to make sure that the reservoir didn't go dry. He'll top it up. Once he's ready, he'll yell at us. We'll let him know that we're ready back here, and we're just going to continually repeat this process. We're starting at the wheel that's furthest from the actuator. So we have our actuator on the front passenger side of the trailer. So we're on the driver rear wheel, and we're just going to work our way towards the front from there, bleeding each one. So now at this point, we've bled them all out. What we were looking for in our hose was for the signs of bubbles. We had nice clean stream of fluid coming out of each one. That means that you've got all the air out of the system. So at this point, just head back up to the front, double check your fluid level, top it up, and you can reinstall your cap. We're then going to go double check to make sure we don't have any leaks on the system. So our assistant's going to pull the pin. We're going to head back to the assemblies back here, particularly where we have like the 4-way and the 3-way. Those are usually the most common leak points, but it can also leak at the calipers. So once he pulls the pin, that'll deadhead the system, putting it at maximum pressure, and then we can verify if we've got any leaks. All right, go ahead, Joe. All right, so the system is now deadheaded. We are fully pressurized. No leaks here, no leaks there, no leaks at our 3-way, no leaks here, and we can see the other side calipers, nothing's coming out of those. So the only thing we got to check is our actuator there at the back. Make sure there's nothing leaking out of the back of that system, and we're good to go. And we have no leaks right here at the back. Everything looks good there. We can insert our pin, and we're ready to put our wheels back in place. So now that we've got all the brakes bled out, that'll complete our installation. We've got everything converted over to electric over hydraulic. I do like to just double check afterwards, make sure that they are releasing properly, make sure that they're applying. You can pull your pin and make sure that each one you can't turn it. And then after you put the pin back in, make sure you can spin them, make sure that they are releasing. Always like do those little checks, make sure that's all good. But at that point, you're ready to reinstall your wheels and torque them back to the trailer specifications, and you're ready to hit the road. And that completes our installation of Hydrastar 1600 PSI hydraulic actuator on our 2019 Grand Design Solitude.